Hi everybody, this is Chuck Dimuro and I'll be reading from The Sound of Medicine. I'll be your guide on this intestine-twisting tour through the preposterous world of artificially stimulated twitch doctors amongst the many qualified physicians in your area. These stories are 100% true fiction. They are not meant to inhibit, minimize, or in any way mitigate your willingness to knowingly risk possible quack exposure. I would like to thank all of the unbelievably little people who made this waste of perfectly good paper not only possible, but inexplicably unavoidable. Clearly, without these fig pickers' unmitigated audacity, a turd of this magnitude could never have been squeezed all the way out. Oh, this comedy of errors was written, performed, and documented on a daily basis in front of a live, stupefied audience by the various relentless idiots who may or may not have created it. My job as a medical transcriber was simply to listen to dictations, type what was said verbatim, and print the work on sticky paper to be placed into the medical records. With most clients, I could do exactly that. Oh, these stories, however, are obviously not about them. Disclaimer. Number 1. These board-certified true fiction donkey tales are intended to be directly applied to any unspecified jackass you may or may not have been and or may not ever be exposed to in the future, the past, the present, or not at all, whichever comes first. Number 2. Most of you should not be allowed to read this unless accompanied by an adult. Number 3. Children over the age of 50 should seek medical attention immediately. Number 4. These pages may or may not contain one or more or less of the following: illicit drug use, jaywalking, grand larceny, urinating in public, human sacrifice, treason, loitering, mass murder, embezzlement, and or totally unsubstantiated accusations of canine alcohol abuse. Number 5. Viewer discretion is highly unlikely. Number 6. This product is to be used for entertainment purposes only. Any similarity to actual reality is 100% unavoidable. Number 7. Non-compliance is not required. Chapter 1. The Suckening. The hills are alive with the sound of malpractice. Over the last 25 to 30 years, I've translated, not transcribed, much nauseating, pretentious dribble for the grammatically challenged into more or less English-based medical records. It has become painfully obvious to me that you can jam all the education you want into some people, but it won't make them any smarter. I'm not writing this because I thought anyone should know about any of it or because someone might benefit from it someday in any way, but purely because I'm pissed off, petty, and vindictive. And I just happen to be able to type considerably more than 100 words a minute effortlessly. I was a painting contractor back in the 1990s, working for a guy who was also the bass player in a bar band I fronted on the weekends. It turned out to be a bad mix, pun intended. The day came when I found myself in need of both a new job and a new bass player simultaneously. During that time, I had taught myself to type a little bit while writing out lyrics to songs. I didn't type up the lyrics because I liked typing. I did it because my handwriting was so bad it looked like I had graduated from med school twice. If you're old enough to remember handwritten prescriptions from your doctor, you know what I'm talking about. At that time, my mom had a small business transcribing medical records at home, and she said any monkey could learn to do it, so I thought I'd give it a try. At first, I thought she was wrong about the monkeys. You have to step on a foot controller to hear through your headphones what the doctor is saying on a crappy magnetic tape and then try to type nearly unrecognizable mumbo jumbo, or get the spray rig out and go back to painting houses. So, I learned to type on a old 35-pound Brother typewriter that had something called a spell check on it, and it was a darn good thing it did because I literally couldn't spell anything. I didn't even know anything was one word. However, trading off freezing in the winter and sweltering in the summer on some crappy construction site for sitting at a desk next to an air conditioner eating Mom's Pop-Tarts was not a difficult choice. I assumed I'd be listening to highly skilled trained professionals using their awe-inspiring linguistic skills to create clear and concise medical documents, and I was right to a certain extent. However, at that point, I was still blissfully ignorant of the difference between the marble garglers Mom was listening to and the semi-articulate snob-tailed spumas that she was handing me to practice my big words on. The medical terminology available in spell checks at that time was limited, to say the least, so we used dozens of medical terminology reference books. One of them was titled 20,000 Medical Abbreviations and subtitled 20,000 Conveniences at the Expense of Accuracy and Safety. What? Why would they print that on the cover of the book, I wondered. It was an obvious slight aimed at the very people who use these apparently inaccurate and potentially dangerous abbreviations on an all too regular basis. Unfortunately, it was just a glimpse of an unimaginable multitude of absurdities yet to be pondered in awe. Eventually, I got to where I knew what I was doing well enough to move my workstation over to my place. At which point, I started typing in my underwear with my own AC and Pop-Tarts. Unfortunately, that was also when I had to start working with some of the more, let me think, what's the technical term for it? Retarded muffhuggers? Yeah, that's it. Retarded muffhuggers. I started to notice that some of these retarded muffhuggers sounded a lot like the retarded muffhuggers at my other job downtown playing music in the bars on the weekends. I knew what some of the people in the bars were on, but what in the world some of these so-called doctors was on was a mystery to me. I actually stood in this one guy's office, listening to what appeared to be a perfectly normal person with nothing more than an MD after his name to indicate otherwise, bragging about how he had been voted the fastest talker in his dictation class at med school. What Dr. Dimwit obviously failed to recognize was that all the other little doctor wannabes were totally laughing at him every time he opened up his ginormous pork chop gobbler to yactate all over the dictation machines. Moronicus Giganticus didn't even seem to realize that he was standing there chattering his fool head off about it to the one person who had been and would continue to be billing him for it on a monthly basis for the duration. Now, back when I was still painting houses, anyone who caused problems and delays on the job site by doing sloppy work could be what they call back-charged for it. And it was clear from the beginning that there was going to be a whole lot of back-charging going on at the new job site, too. We were taking on new accounts at the time, and we trained quite a few people to do this kind of work. Even my dim-witted ex-insignificant other Miss Methenstein the Anti-Crystal could do it. However, she was an especially thick slice of inbred who actually thought the term computer virus was stupid because everybody knows machines can't get sick. Apparently, she thought a computer virus was spread by them coughing on each other. So I was not surprised one morning when I asked why there was mud on the refrigerator And she said, "It's probably not mud, it's probably just wet dirt." Well, you can't fault her logic on that one, I suppose. Now imagine you got a hangover, you get out of bed, get a cup of coffee, you sit down, put on your little Transcriber headphones, and you hear, "I received a copy of the pathology report that was excised from the patient's left nasal area." In English, that literally means some other drunk doctor surgically removed a pathology report from the patient's nose and somehow made a copy of it to send to Dr. Quackenstein, leaving this reporter to ask the question, do these fools actually expect me to ignore what they say and just type whatever I decide they meant? And of course the answer is a resounding, yep. Chapter 2, Taxo versus Ersatzo. Once upon a time, there was a medication Dr. Dorkenstein prescribed regularly called Taxo. However, I never actually heard the word Taxo come out of his mouth because what he would say after looking at the letters that spell the real word Taxo is the imaginary word Ersatzo. Unable to find a medication named Ersatzo anywhere, I simply left yet another blank line, like all the rest. I assume someone at the office must be familiar with this mysterious medication and would eventually send along a sticky note with the correct spelling. Of course, there's no such word in the English language as Ersatzo. So sometime later, I hear, "Chalk, you're not understanding me when I say..." Duh. Ersatzo. That's E as in Edward, R as in Robert, T as in Tom, A as in Apple, C as in Cat, Z as in Zed, and O as in Orange, Ersatzo. Did you catch that? Old Twinkletongue mispronounces Taxo, says Ersatzo, then proceeds to correctly spell Taxo one letter at a time, military style, with an example for each letter. Then he repeats Ersatzo instead of Taxo as if he just won the Special Olympic Spelling Bee. I can still literally hear some of the staff snickering in the background. I don't know if they were laughing at Dr. Shizzles for brains for being such an insufferable ass, or if they were laughing at me for having to tolerate it. For years after that, I would go ahead and type Taxo every time I heard the word Ersatzo. But eventually it got on my nerves to the point that I couldn't resist writing Tweakenstein a sticky note that said, "Every time you say Ersatzo, I type Taxo. Is that correct?" So he sends back a note that says, "Yes, that is correct, spelled out in nearly indecipherable microscopic chicken scratches with a one-eyed smiley face drawn on it like some kind of retarded little cherry on top of a great big piece of moron-flavored midget cake." Now, for some reason, Dr. Porkensnort eventually stopped prescribing Taxo. I suppose that particular medication must have wandered off to die alone after the good doctor was finished with it, which, by the way, according to statistics, is the exact same fate the American medical mafia has in store for the rest of us. Chapter 3, Chocolate Exposure. Procedure note. Procedure explained. Consent signed. The area was prepped with Hibiclenza, at which point the lesion was inadvertently removed during the application of the cleanser. What? I thought old Tinkle Squirt meant the lesion was accidentally knocked off with a washcloth or something reasonable like that. Nope. Dr. Humperdinck goes on to say in the most exquisitely pompous tone of voice he could muster, upon further questioning, the patient does admit to perhaps some previous chocolate exposure during her prior luncheon activity. What? Did he just say the patient had a chocolate spot on her face? And after his thorough medical examination, it was determined to be so dangerous that it needed to be removed immediately? Oh, that's right. Dr. Doofus was about to hack a bit of chocolate off the poor lady's face with an X-Acto knife. Then he was going to stitch up the wound he inflicted and send the chocolate spot to the pathology lab to see just how dangerous of a smudge it might turn out to be. But the whole show fell apart when Dr. Van Dork apparently took a swipe at the so-called lesion with a little bit of cleanser on a cotton ball, and that darn thing came right off. Well, hell's bells, there goes that surgical fee in the old trash can, and a perfectly good cotton ball, too. I felt like a fly on the wall in a room full of shit sandwiches. And I wondered, can flies laugh? Not likely. I'd probably just shake my little fly head and say something like, bizarre, man, totally bizarre. The next thing I hear is, my reassessment number 1 is chocolate exposure. Therefore, no pathology will be sent. Chuck, send a copy of this note to the patient's primary care provider. What? Chocolate exposure? Does he actually want me to put that on the report? And he's not gonna send the chocolate spot to the pathology lab to see if it's any more of a threat to the patient than he is? Okay. Chapter 3, The Bitter End. Towards the end of my transcribing career, there was only one account left, and of course it had to be this one. Old Pork and Spew made all the other zit poppers look like a bunch of, well, brain surgeons, I suppose you could say, but that's just to quote a phrase. I must have been kicking puppies and selling bunk crack to homeless orphans in another life to wind up having to listen to this morbidly obese circuit freak midget pissing in my ear. It's just as well, though. Otherwise, I couldn't possibly have worked up enough animosity to sit here typing up a bunch of incoherent rambling about a bunch of incoherent rambling. This particular drunk especially likes spelling big words for me like anus and brain. I called him the most anomalous expression of the human genome to ever stain the inside of a lab coat. He even spelled the word dose for me one day. Apparently I had inadvertently typed the word does instead of dose, as does happen from time to time when typing the words dose and does over and over dozens of times because somebody doesn't know how to use the past tense of any of the words that are coming out of his mouth. Instead of realizing that and just sending the work back to me to be corrected like anyone of at least below average intelligence would, the Zilwad decides dumb old Chuck must have actually forgotten how to spell the word dose after 25 years of transcribing medical records. Oh yeah? Well, I can still remember how to spell Uzi, but we'll have to come back to that later. I assure you it's not what you're probably thinking right now, but I can't say that never crossed my mind. Meanwhile, back at the not-so-funny farm, Countin' Sultula spends the next 2 to 3 minutes spelling the word dose for me one letter at a time, nice and slow, with an example for each letter. D as in dog, O as in orange. Then Dork Vader proceeds to define the word dose for me, starting the matter-of-factually that, or stating matter-factually, in the medical field, the word dose is used to describe a specific amount of medication. Now, the only cure for this type of behavior is to take away the keys to the medicine cabinet and administer a good solid slap right upside the old melon so hard that, number one, maybe he'd start speaking English. Number two, his grandkids would be born dizzy. Number three, his own stockbroker wouldn't recognize him. Number four, I'd have to send his bill to him at the rehab facility. Number five, they'd have to shave his ass and make him walk backwards to keep him from scaring the patients, something that needed to be done anyway. And number six, none of the above, because I got tired of sucking on the barrel and finally just pulled the damn trigger. Chapter 4, 800-pound gorillas. Yes, folks, there actually is an 800-pound gorilla in the room who's high as a kite, but no one can hear it except me. Now, speaking strictly as a retired musician, I can assure you that virtually all ridiculous behavior is drug and or alcohol related, especially when you're talking about people who somehow managed to graduate from med school and apparently forgot how to speak their own language. Why do you think they call it med school? Nowadays, our medical records are created on the templates we all see in the computer screens and in doctors' exam rooms, which your chemically enhanced doctor sits in front of trying to fill out while you think he or she is listening to you. However, Dr. Transcriber can't actually hear much of what you're saying because he or she is too busy having to do their job and what used to be the medical transcriber's job at the same time, in order to cut corners and make money for the investment groups who own them. Earlier, I mentioned the word oozy and that I would have to come back to it later. Well, now it's later. I was sitting in my chair one day, not painting houses and enjoying the AC and the Pop-Tarts, in my underwear when I came across Dipzilla trying to spell the word oozy for me. Apparently, this patient did not have oozing lesions, but instead he or she had oozy lesions. Unfortunately, Uzi is the name of a compact machine gun wielded by the Israeli Defense Forces and would not belong in anyone's medical records unless, of course, they just happen to have been shot with one recently. In which case, I suppose they could have what you might call oozy lesions, but only if you're a total spaz. But wait, there's more. As if that wasn't a big enough dose of tardonephrine, Dorkzilla's mixture must have been running a little richer than usual, and I hear, Chuck, that's oozy. O-O-Z-Y. Oozy. I was waiting to hear his example of another word that starts with the letter oo, but for some reason, Dr. Delirium didn't come up with one. Of course, oo is not actually a letter in any alphabet in any language anywhere in the world, but apparently that don't matter when you're edumacated. Asaplambuin. I was asked by a physician's assistant how in the world it is that I know what to type when she could plainly hear the good doctor spewing nonsense like Asaplambuin nabatosa. I told her it's a magic trick that I learned from Tibetan monks. My calling what I do a magic trick wasn't that far from the truth. In order to decipher this horrendous mess I was handed every day, in the beginning I had to make macros comprised of sentences I found by searching old records my mom had typed years ago for words that seemed to match some of those pig fart noises I was hearing. The Rosetta Stone, so to speak, was found when I noticed old Limberlips was always saying snon just before starting a new dictation. Snon was always followed by yet another unintelligible patient name, and patient names are typically preceded by the words "next is a note on." Therefore, Snon must be that entire phrase jammed into one syllable. How about Asplambwin? Hell, that could be the entire Pledge of Allegiance upside down, backwards, and in Chinese for all I know. I also told the PA I could hear her and some of the other staff snickering out loud in the background and occasionally busting into uncontrolled laughter while we were all being entertained by this retard speed freaking on the dictation machine in his cubicle after he obviously powered down a couple of Ritalin flavored slushies for lunch. Apparently, Spiffy Lips' strategy to overcome the dilemma of having been born so stunningly defective was to not only slur entire sentences into single syllables, but to also slur entire paragraphs into pure gibbery-style oinkery. What I would get were words like pinflonly and nabatosa. It sounded like he had a terminal case of AOSS. That's asinine oral shorthand syndrome. Of course, Nabatosa will go through the spell check like a golf ball through a garden hose, so when he would say imaginary words like Asplamo, Nabatosa, Penfloenstein, Snumber, Slinagos, Penfloenstein, Snumber, I would type the real words. Assessment and plan number 1, non-inflamed seborrheic keratosis, plan to follow only at the present time. Next number, solar lentigos, plan to follow only at the present time. Can you believe that? I never could. Go ahead, read it again. After you stop laughing, it won't make a lick of sense the second time around either. Wait, let me go back and read this at the speed that it's typically delivered to me. Asplama Napatosa Influence Summer, Selena goes Influence Summer. Oh, okay. Just making sure you got the picture there. Next chapter, Dead in the Turn Lane. My ex-insignificant other comes home from dropping off the work at the offices one day and tells me about a conversation she had with Dr. Token, Snort's assistant, who told her that old Speed for Brains had just spent nearly 20 minutes chattering her fool head off in the dictation cubicle while the waiting room was about to reach critical mass when her assistant noticed that the dictaphone Dr. Quackmeyer thought she was jibber-jabbering into was actually sitting idle on the desk in her office across the hallway behind her. Now, what's even more bizarre is that when using an analog dictation machine, you have to actually push buttons like record, rewind, stop, start, and so on. Maybe even change a tape now and then. What this quack's assistant was describing to my ex would have been entirely implausible and absolutely unbelievable had the subject of the conversation not been a drug addict who just happened to have their own personal prescription pad. When an older female patient walked into the office without an appointment in the middle of the afternoon because she had been having chest pains, this unnatural disaster of a doctor told an overweight middle-aged woman in obvious cardiac distress to go back outside in the heat of the day, get back in her car, and drive herself to the emergency room at the far end of the next city. The next dictations were from the day before. So if the patient was going to die of quack exposures, it probably already happened. Sure enough, the next day I hear that woman was found dead in the turn lane out in front of the hospital at the far end of the next city less than 20 minutes later. However, There were no further complaints of chest pain, so I was surprised to hear this criminal didn't write his freshly deceased patient a prescription for fen-phen and a work release note for St. Peter. This winter was one of the last so-called primary care providers I knew to be involved in the fen-phen atrocity. Fen-phen was a form of super methamphetamine that was being prescribed to obese cardiac patients who needed to lose weight to decrease their chances of having a heart attack. Who didn't see this one coming? Obese patients with cardiac problems being prescribed methamphetamine. It wasn't until these so-called doctors had finally maimed and killed enough people to get the keys to their new cars and houses that the lawsuits began approaching the limit in acceptable losses for the pharmaceutical companies, and fen-phen disappeared overnight. Oh well, at least all those dead patients aren't fat anymore. Mission accomplished, right? Wait, what was the mission again? A history of violence. Still think your doctors couldn't be any more dangerous than whatever you went to see them about? Think again. Millionaires don't just fall out of the sky. It's a club that most of us are not in. If you think you're safe in their hands, then all I can say is show me someone who isn't afraid of snakes and I'll show you someone who's bound to get bit. Who killed George Washington? Doctors. Elvis? Doctors. Michael Jackson? Doctors. How about Joan Rivers? She died in the exam room while being selfied by her doctor's staff, who didn't even realize poor old Joan was expiring right under their criminally negligent noses during a routine follow-up exam for a facelift. I'm sure it was not at all the type of headlines Miss Rivers had in mind. Now, when my son Gideon was still in school, he couldn't keep still in the classroom and was considered to be what doctors were calling ADHD. This so-called condition was manufactured by German drug companies so they could peddle methamphetamine to children legally in America. By the time Gideon was in the 8th grade, my mom convinced me that a trip to the doctor was in order since my immature son wouldn't quit acting so immature. A short time later, in the doctor's office of a child psychologist, I asked what the process was for diagnosing ADHD. He said that there were only a few attention span and problem-solving tests and that there are no lab tests or clinical exams of any sort that are used to diagnose any physiological or psychological, conditions whatsoever. And there never has been. I asked him what it is then that Ritalin was supposed to do for my son. The way he put it to me was that Ritalin is just something like a strong cup of coffee and everyone just naturally does a little better at concentrating when they have a mild stimulant on board. It seemed reasonable. I drank a lot of coffee myself and hadn't been spanked for acting up in class for years. I let my guard down and went along with handing this devastating and unbelievably powerful drug to my son before I found out the hard way what Ritalin actually is. Early on a summer night, back in the 1990s, me and the guys in the band had been drinking all day at practice. After they left, I noticed a prescription bottle lying out on the pool table. It was my son's Ritalin. I had heard the kids were selling this stuff at school and partying on it. I was really tired, but it was Friday night and we weren't playing that weekend, so I wanted to stay up and drink more like any self-respecting alcoholic would. However, being the cautious type that I am, it's always been my policy to stick a toe in the water before jumping in with both feet, and it's a damn good thing too, because I believe I would have died that night otherwise. I decided I would just try a half of one of these little cup of coffee-like stimulants. There were certainly plenty of them. I weighed over 180 pounds at the time, twice my son's weight, and I'd been drinking all day, but within 15 minutes of ingesting a half of a Ritalin tablet, I had the phone in my hand and very nearly called Poison Control Center in a state of panic over what that stuff was doing to me. You say it serves me right? You say I had no business taking medications prescribed for someone else? I would have agreed with you up until then. Now I say, before anyone ever hands their kid a psychoactive drug they got from their quack doctor, it should first have to be ingested by the two of you. I didn't think there was even a remote possibility that something I was told would help my kid could make every substance I ever experimented with seem like a bunch of Flintstones chewables. I didn't know what to think. I talked to Gideon about it the next day, but he said he liked Ritalin because he could finally behave himself in school and learn stuff like the other kids. By the time he was in his early 30s, Gideon had been a career drug addict for more than 15 years, but he managed to get clean and stay clean for a few months at one point. He came by nearly every day to see me for a while after years of avoiding me because of the way he was living. He said the real reason he liked Ritalin back in school was because the money he made selling it to his friends and getting high on it. He said he loved me and he was sorry about all the trouble, and then all too soon he was gone again. Pretty much every day now, I drive by skinny young men with their hoodies pulled down over their heads. They walk the streets alone in dirty clothes, pushing broken shopping carts full of all the nothing they own or ever will own. And the tears run down my face again for a minute or two, for a block or two. And I remember my son before we took him to see a doctor for having too much fun in life. He was a good kid, and I miss him. Epilogue. The sound of medicine has been nearly drowned out by the ringing in my ears nowadays. I don't front rock bands anymore, but depending on when you're reading this, I may or may not still be listening to filthy rich, overfed, blood-sucking, parasitic Nazi Satan spawn documenting important stuff like who did or didn't apologize for missing their appointments. It should be pretty obvious by now, though, that I couldn't care less about any quasi-doctor's medical-ish opinions regarding anything I have to say on the subject. The only way I might catch any quack-flackery over this puddle of dung is if the semi-solids floating in it realize they're the idiots they just saw me talking smack about on the Oprah Winfrey show and decide they're gonna sue. And what would they say to their attorneys, I wonder? I'm one of the morons in The Sound of Medicine and I can prove it? End of transmission.